Energy Media readers, today we're going to be talking to Sandy Garacino, one of our favorite independent journalists, and we're going to be talking about foreign funding or supposed foreign funding of some of the protesters and activists who have been involved with the Wet'suwet'en protests against the Coastal GasLink pipeline, and as well as the rail blockades that have taken place out in Eastern Canada that in sympathy with the Wet'suwet'en. So Sandy, welcome to the interview.
Nice to be here, Markham. Thanks for having me on.
Now, you and I have had many discussions around the foreign funding of activism around oil and gas and pipelines. And you did a very comprehensive piece on Vivian Krause's allegations about foreign funding, because you went, I did the work, the reporting from the environmental group side, and you went on the other side, and there's a huge database down in the US that you accessed to do the research on the foundation side, the American Foundation side. And if I understand your conclusions correctly, the amount of funding from American and foreign foundations is greatly exaggerated. Fair comment?
Fair comment. I mean, the quantum, the amount has been generally agreed to be around $40 million. There are claims that are made in the hundreds of millions of dollars. You only get there if you ignore what the data actually says. The very large grants have been for large conservation projects, not for any kind of activism or community organizing or anything like that. Very important distinction. All of the grants that I have seen have related to oil sands development and pipelines. They do not relate to the Coastal GasLink pipeline at all, which has zippo to do with the organizing. So I've had a chance to go in and update. I haven't comprehensively reviewed, as in going through with a fine-tooth comb to look at everything, but you know, you use filters and you look for searches of recipient destination geographically.
Now, that doesn't surprise me really, because in the evidence, as far as we can tell, that I can tell, and I'm just beginning to set up interviews with the Wet'suwet'en representatives and others, and I will ask the question about funding, but this seems to be a grassroots kind of organization. It seems to be self-funded. And we don't see even the little dribs and drabs maybe that come in from, I mean, that we couldn't possibly trace through the kind of work that you're doing, but really seem inconsequential.
Yes, there's no question about it. I mean, fundamentally, the fundamental takeaway is that there are a lot of people banging on about this issue. I think in some ways to distract from the fact that the beneficiary organizations, the partners of Coastal GasLink and TC Energy here, this is all to benefit Royal Dutch Shell, Korea Gas, Petronas, Mitsubishi, and foreign and large multi-billion dollar foreign companies. I mean, there's over $1 trillion in foreign market capitalization that is looking to benefit from this pipeline. And the most that you can see is like there's a few grants a few years ago for like 10 or 20 or $50,000 here and there for organizations that are objecting to that pipeline.
And I would argue, and you have argued, in fact, we both argued in the context of Ms. Krause's conspiracy narratives, that even if that money is coming in to fund the Wet'suwet'en protests and the other blockades, that's still cricket. That is, it's not illegal. I would argue it is not immoral. I mean, these days with the climate change crisis and a tremendous amount of concern in North America, I would be surprised if we didn't see some money that had been granted by American foundations find its way to some of the protesters. I'm okay with that. My argument has always been that if you don't like the protesters' argument, come up with a better one. And suppressing the protest is not the way to go. Your take, please.
Well, that's exactly, to me, stick with the merits, not with who's getting money from where. Because this is really a distraction. And I point again to what's going on around the world, which is everywhere in the world, especially authoritarian regimes, whether it's Russia or Brazil. India has done this everywhere. That there is development, natural resource development, and human right, and sometimes human rights issues. Governments and industry have advanced this argument that about foreign funding of anybody who opposes them. Well, all of these companies are major international companies. TC Energy is operating in the United States. It's operating in Mexico. Is that not okay? Do we want TC Energy not to be able to operate in Mexico? Do we want them not to be able to operate? This is a global world, and I think it's flatly insulting to suggest that small indigenous communities should have to rely on bake sales and bingo halls to deal with major global money. There are billions of dollars of foreign capital invested in TC Energy alone that I was able to locate. So this is a fake, in my opinion, this is a fake issue, and it's meant to distract from and to discredit the legitimate aims of Indigenous organizations. No matter how you come down on what you think the ultimate objective and the ultimate solution should be, we shouldn't be insulting people, and we shouldn't be insulting people's intelligence with this kind of what I think is propaganda.
We have had discussions, you and I, about the Great Bear Rainforest, and because that initiative in various phases did receive funding from American charities, and has been pilloried by Ms. Krause and MLA Ellis Ross, who's an Indigenous leader in BC. And the issue here is that many of these First Nations, and really almost all First Nations at the end of the day, do not have the capacity to undertake or to participate in environmental review processes and land use planning, that sort of thing that they need, the kind of expertise and capacity they need to defend and exercise their rights over Aboriginal title in their traditional territory. And that's where a lot of this money comes from. It's not activism, it's land use planning and capacity building, which, based on what you've seen in the database of funding from American foundations. Would you agree with my take on this?
Yeah, I would take it even further. One of the things to remember is that most of the money that was committed by international philanthropies to the Great Bear Rainforest Project in its different iterations was committed years before there was any suggestion of a oil and gas pipeline going through there. So nobody had any idea that there was a proposed, for instance, Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, the natural gas pipelines, natural gas fracking projects were not in the cards. These were strictly, at the time, environmental conservation projects. They were partnered with by the Harper government under John Baird as environment minister. They were partnered with the BC Liberal provincial government in British Columbia. There's a lot, these were negotiations that were worked on and led by forestry companies, fisheries interests, because this is a complex area. And the largest funder in the Great Bear Rainforest is the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, which is probably the most illustrious scientific foundation and especially marine conservation foundation in the world. And its major objective is preservation of the North Pacific salmon habitats. None of this is about environmental activism. And by the way, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation overtly keeps itself out of anything to do with climate issues. They are all about marine conservation, period.
Yes, and Ms. Kraus would disagree with you vehemently, and no doubt has on Twitter. But so this will be my last question slash comment, Sandy. And I think what's happened is that we've had decades of legal challenges. Lawyer Bill Gallagher from Ontario, who has written the book Resource Rulers, has counted up the number of legal wins by First Nations over the last 2 or 3 decades. And I think it's well over 300 now, maybe even higher. And the point that Bill makes, and I would agree with this, is that a reckoning was bound to come for Canada when it comes to First Nation, to Aboriginal title and management of the lands, the traditional territories. And it's no surprise, given the fact that BC is mostly made up of unceded territory. There aren't treaties. It's no surprise that it would happen in BC first and loudest. And so I think this is not so much a protest that needs to be put down. I certainly don't believe that. But I think this is the beginning of Canada finally coming to grips with this issue so that we can put in place agreements and processes that we can both respect Aboriginal title and Indigenous law, and at the same time get the resource projects done that we need to drive our economy. Your take, please.
Gosh, there's so much there. I think absolutely you're right. What most Canadians don't really have any concept of is that in British Columbia, most of British Columbia has no treaties with Indigenous, with First Nations at all. So this is, and everybody has been kind of limping along, engaging in local agreements, and you see these community benefit agreements that are going on with the TMX and have also happened with Coastal GasLink. But there are fundamental and deep philosophical problems and issues. I think the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are mounting really an existential challenge. This is not about well, what amount of money will satisfy them. They just straight up say, we're not part of Canada. We never agreed to be part of Canada. We aren't part of any of this. Oh, and by the way, where do you think your natural resources that are the foundation of your economy come from? How did you get them? How did you arrive at them? Did you earn them? Did you pay for them? You know, these are, and we as Canada, you know, where's our moral high ground here? I mean, this is actually kind of the biggest problem that we face, is that existentially, as a nation with 37 million people, we have economies that are dependent on this that we cannot ignore. We can't, our critical national infrastructure must continue, and yet we have no moral high ground. So how do we solve this? There is the problem. It's a tough one. I don't envy any government leader. Lots of opposition leaders and lots of everybody is going to make hay on this one for a long time to come.
Sandy, thank you very much for this. I always enjoy chatting with you, and we look forward to chatting about this particular issue and in the broader issue around Indigenous rights, Indigenous law. This is not going away. This is really the first shot in a much bigger battle, a much bigger war. And so we'll look forward to talking to you about this down the road. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.